In 1945, Winston Churchill stood on a balcony in London, waving to 1 million cheering citizens celebrating victory over Nazi Germany. The British Empire, the largest in human history, controlled nearly 25% of the Earth's landmass. Over 700 million people lived under the British Crown. From India to Nigeria, from Hong Kong to Jamaica, from Kenya to Malaya, the sun literally did not set on British territory. 20 years later, it was almost completely gone. Not in centuries like Rome, not in generations like the Ottomans. In 20 years. The greatest empire the world had ever seen collapsed faster than any other in recorded history. And here's what they don't teach you in school. The British didn't lose a great war. They didn't suffer an invasion. They didn't experience a revolution. They won World War II, and then they lost everything anyway. The real story of how Britain went from ruling a quarter of the planet to being just another medium-sized European nation involves 3 critical moments that most history books either skip entirely or explain in the most boring way possible. The first was a decision Winston Churchill made in 1947 that he never wanted to make. The second was an 8-day war in 1956 that ended in the most humiliating defeat in modern British history. A defeat that didn't come from their enemies, but from their closest ally. And the third was a single speech in 1960 that effectively announced, "We're done." But the real reason the British Empire collapsed wasn't about individual decisions or specific events. It was about a lie the British told themselves for so long that by the time they realized the truth, it was already too late. The lie was simple, that the people they colonized actually wanted to be colonized. And once that lie fell apart, millions of people across Africa and Asia made it violently clear that they did not consent to being ruled by London. The empire didn't have years to respond. It had months. Because here's what most people don't understand about the British Empire. By 1945, it wasn't actually profitable anymore. It was costing more to maintain than it was generating. The whole thing was running on fumes and reputation. And reputation, it turns out, can evaporate overnight. What you're about to learn is the real sequence of events that turned the world's greatest superpower into a cautionary tale. And if you think empires collapsing is just ancient history, if you think this couldn't happen to modern superpowers, stick around. Because the pattern Britain followed is one we've seen before, and we're seeing it again right now. Here's what everyone believes about Britain after World War II. They were heroes. The plucky island nation that stood alone against Hitler. The bulldog spirit. Churchill's speeches. The Blitz. Victory. And that part is absolutely true. Britain genuinely did save Western civilization from fascism. Between 1940 and 1941, they were the only major power still fighting the Nazis. The courage was real. The sacrifice was real. 450,000 British soldiers, sailors, and civilians died in that war. But here's what the victory celebration in 1945 obscured. What the waving flags and Churchill cigars distracted everyone from seeing, Britain was completely, utterly, catastrophically broke. Not just struggling financially, not in a recession, bankrupt. The national debt had exploded from £7.1 billion in 1939 to £21 billion by 1945. In today's money, that's roughly £900 billion, accumulated in just 6 years. Britain had sold off overseas investments worth billions. They'd liquidated gold reserves. They'd borrowed from everyone who would lend. United States. Through the Lend-Lease program and direct loans, America had essentially financed Britain's survival. By 1945, Britain owed the United States $4. They wouldn't finish paying off until December 2006. Let that sink in. Britain was still paying for World War II into the 21st century. The economist John Maynard Keynes, who negotiated Britain's post-war loans, called it, quote, financial Dunkirk, crisis of the first order. So here was the situation in 1945. Britain had just won a war, but they were economically devastated, still controlled the largest empire in history. And maintaining that empire required soldiers, administrators, ships, and resources they no longer had. Churchill understood this, in private at least. Publicly, he kept talking about imperial glory. But the numbers didn't lie. Keeping 40,000 troops in Palestine cost £40 million a year. Maintaining order in Malaya cost even more. India, the jewel in the crown, required a constant military presence of over 100,000 British and Indian soldiers. The empire wasn't generating profit anymore. It was draining a bankrupt nation. But admitting this publicly, acknowledging that Britain could no longer afford its empire, that would mean admitting that everything they told themselves about British superiority, about the civilizing mission, about being a first-tier power, was no longer true. So Churchill's government did what empires in decline always do. They pretended everything was fine. If you're learning something here that school never taught you, consider subscribing. We break. Until events in India forced Britain to face a truth they'd been avoiding for decades. Winston Churchill had a very specific view of India. He'd stated it publicly, repeatedly, and without apology. In 1943, during a war cabinet discussion about famine in Bengal, a famine that would kill between 2 and 3 million people, Churchill reportedly blamed the Indians themselves, asking why Gandhi hadn't died yet. His position was clear. India was not ready for self-governance. The Indian people needed British rule. Independence would lead to chaos, civil war, and the destruction of everything Britain had built. This wasn't a fringe position. It was mainstream British imperial thinking. The entire justification for the empire rested on this idea that British rule was benevolent, civilizing, and necessary. That, without British administrators, courts, railways, and institutions, places like India would collapse into barbarism. There was just one problem with this theory. Indians didn't agree with it. By 1945, the independence movement in India wasn't some small group of agitators. It was a mass movement involving hundreds of millions of people. The Indian National Congress, led by figures like Jawaharlal Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi, had been demanding independence for decades. The Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, wanted a separate Muslim state. Both agreed on one thing: the British had to go. And here's what changed after World War II. Britain could no longer afford to say no. In February 1946, 20,000 sailors of the Royal Indian Navy mutinied in Bombay. They weren't alone. The mutiny spread to 78 ships across India. British officers were helpless. The Indian, Clement Attlee, who had replaced Churchill as Prime Minister in July 1945, faced an impossible choice: send in British troops to crush the mutiny? With what troops? Britain had just demobilized millions of soldiers. And even if they could muster the forces, what then? A war against 400 million Indians? In February 1947, Attlee announced that Britain would leave India no later than June 1948. He appointed Lord Louis Mountbatten as the last viceroy of India, with one job: get out. Mountbatten looked at the situation and made a decision that still reverberates today. He moved the date up, way up. Instead of June 1948, independence would happen on August 15, 1947, just 6 months away. Why the rush? Because Mountbatten could see what better to leave fast, hand over power, and let Indians sort out the mess. The mess they left behind was catastrophic. The partition of India into two nations, India and Pakistan, triggered the largest mass migration in human history. Between 10 and 20 million people crossed borders. Trains arrived at stations carrying nothing but corpses. Estimates of the death toll range from 200,000 to 2 million people killed in sectarian violence. Churchill, now in opposition, called it a shameful flight and a scuttle. He blamed Attlee, Mountbatten, everyone except the policies he himself had championed for decades. But here's the crucial point. Once India was gone, everything else started unraveling. India wasn't just a colony, it was the empire. It was where Britain got soldiers for its other colonies. It was the strategic centerpiece of everything. As one historian put it, without India, there was no British Empire, just scattered territories. And scattered territories are expensive to maintain, especially when people in those territories start getting ideas about independence too. The psychological impact of losing India cannot be overstated. For a century, British identity had been wrapped up in the idea of imperial greatness, the empire on which the sun never sets. British schoolchildren grew up with maps showing a quarter of the world colored pink. Politicians of all parties talked about Britain's civilizing mission, its special role in history. And then suddenly, the biggest piece of that empire was gone, not conquered by a rival power, not lost in war, just handed over. Because Britain couldn't afford to keep it anymore. Some people adapted. Clement Attlee and the Labour government began reimagining Britain as a leader of the Commonwealth, a loose association of former colonies that would maintain ties with London. The welfare state would replace the empire as the source of national pride. Britain would be smaller but fairer. Others refused to accept this new reality. And this is where the story gets really interesting, because the people who couldn't accept decline set in motion the single most humiliating episode in modern British history. By the early 1950s, Egypt had become the focal point of Britain's remaining imperial pretensions. The Suez Canal, which connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, was arguably the most strategically important waterway in the world. British troops had been stationed in the Canal Zone since 1882. The canal was operated by the Suez Canal Company, owned primarily by British and French shareholders. Egypt wanted them out. In 1952, a group of military officers led by Gamal Abdel Nasser overthrew King Farouk. By 1954, Nasser was effectively in control of Egypt. He was young, charismatic, anti-colonial, and increasingly popular across the Arab world. He made no secret of his goal: complete Egyptian sovereignty, including over the Suez Canal. British Prime Minister Anthony Eden had a visceral hatred of Nasser. Eden saw him as another Hitler, a dictator who had to be stopped before he grew too powerful. This comparison was not based on evidence. It was based on Eden's own psychological scars from the 1930s when he'd resigned from government over appeasement of Nazi Germany. Eden was determined not to make the same mistake twice. He would stand up to Nasser. He would show strength. On July 26, 1956, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company. He didn't steal it. He paid compensation to shareholders at market rates. He didn't close the canal. Ships continued to pass through. All he did was announce that the canal, which ran through Egyptian territory, would now be operated by Egypt. But to Eden, this was an act of war. Drop a subscribe if you're following this story. We're about to get to the part where everything falls apart in just 8 days. What happened next is almost impossible to believe. It sounds like something from a spy novel, not actual history. But it's all documented. Britain couldn't simply attack Egypt. That would look like colonial aggression, which post-1945 was no longer acceptable in international politics. The United Nations existed. World opinion mattered. The United States, now the dominant Western power, had made clear that the age of European colonialism was over. So Britain came up with a plan, a secret plan. A plan so cynical and so obviously dishonest that when it was eventually exposed, it destroyed British credibility for a generation. On October 22, 1956, representatives of Britain, France, and Israel met at a villa in Sèvres, outside Paris. There, they agreed to a conspiracy. Israel would invade Egypt. Britain and France would then issue an ultimatum demanding that both sides withdraw from the Canal Zone. Egypt would obviously refuse. You can't withdraw from your own territory. This would give Britain and France the pretext to invade as peacekeepers to separate the combatants. It was a lie from start to finish, and everyone involved knew it was a lie. The Israeli invasion began on October 29, 1956, right on schedule. Britain and France issued their ultimatum on October 30th. Nasser refused. On October 31st, British and French planes began bombing Egyptian airfields. For about 48 hours, it looked like the plan might work. British and French forces landed on November 5th. The Egyptian military was no match for them. And then everything collapsed. President Dwight Eisenhower was furious. The United States had not been consulted about this invasion. Eisenhower, who was in the middle of a presidential election campaign, running on a platform of peace, learned about the attack from news reports. He felt personally betrayed by Eden. What happened next demonstrated exactly where power in the world now resided. The United States threatened to sell its holdings of British pounds, which would cause a catastrophic collapse of the British currency. Simultaneously, they blocked British access to International Monetary Fund loans. With Britain's economy already fragile, this was an existential threat. The message was clear: stop the invasion or face economic ruin. On November 6th, just 6 days after the bombing began, Eden ordered a ceasefire. By December 22nd, British forces had withdrawn completely from Egypt. The Suez Crisis lasted 8 days. And in those 8 days, every illusion Britain had maintained about being a great power was shattered. Here's what Suez proved, beyond any doubt. Britain could not take significant military action anywhere in the world without American permission. Britain was not an independent power. It was, at best, America's junior partner. All the talk of special relationships and Atlantic partnerships couldn't hide the basic reality. The United States gave orders, and Britain followed them. British diplomat Evelyn Shuckburgh wrote in his diary, "We have been reduced from a first-class to a third-class power." Foreign Secretary Harold Macmillan, who had initially supported the invasion, now understood the truth. Britain, he later said, could never again resort to military action outside British territory without at least American acquiescence. Anthony Eden resigned in January 1957. Broken in health and reputation, he would spend the rest of his life trying to justify Suez. He never really succeeded. But here's the thing about Suez that most people miss. It didn't just humiliate Britain. It showed every colonized people in the world that European empires could be defied, that the old powers were weak. That independence was not just possible, it was inevitable. And no one understood this better than Harold Macmillan, who replaced Eden as Prime Minister, because Macmillan was about to do something that shocked the British establishment to its core. Harold Macmillan was an unlikely revolutionary. He was an old Etonian, a product of the British establishment, the kind of conservative who should have defended the empire to his last breath. He'd served in World War I, been wounded 3 times, and carried fragments of bullets in his body for the rest of his life. But Macmillan was also intelligent enough to read the writing on the wall. After Suez, he became Prime Minister in January 1957. Almost immediately, he began making decisions that his own party found difficult to accept. Ghana became independent in March 1957, the first sub-Saharan African colony to gain independence. Malaya followed in August 1957. These could be explained away. Ghana had a relatively educated elite and stable institutions. Malaya was geographically distant and strategically less important. The empire was retreating at the margins, not at its core. But Macmillan knew that the margins were just the beginning. In January 1960, he embarked on a tour of Africa. On February 3rd, he stood before the Parliament of South Africa in Cape Town and delivered one of the most significant speeches in British imperial history. "The wind of change is blowing through this continent," Macmillan declared. "Whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact. We must all accept it as a fact, and our national policies must take account of it." The speech was carefully worded, but the message was unmistakable. Britain was getting out of Africa. The age of empire was ending, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The reaction was explosive. The South African government, committed to apartheid and white rule, was horrified. British conservatives felt betrayed. Here was a conservative prime minister essentially announcing the surrender of the empire his party had spent a century building. But Macmillan understood something his critics didn't. The empire was already over. The only question was whether Britain would leave with some dignity or be thrown out by force. Here's why the timing mattered. Across Africa, the costs were enormous, both financially and morally. France was fighting a savage war in Algeria that was tearing apart French society. Macmillan looked at these examples and made a calculation. Better to negotiate departure than to fight losing wars across an entire continent. If you're realizing how much of this history got left out of your education, you're not alone. Subscribe and join hundreds of thousands of viewers who are finally learning what really happened. Within 3 years of the Wind of Change speech, 17 African countries achieved independence. Somalia, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Tanganyika, Uganda, Kenya. One after another, the pink sections of the map disappeared. The process was stunningly fast. Countries that had been colonies for generations became independent nations in months. British administrators who had expected to spend their careers in Africa suddenly found themselves packing bags. And here's the part that rarely gets discussed. The speed of withdrawal created chaos. Britain didn't build stable institutions over decades. They left behind hastily drawn borders that ignored ethnic and tribal realities. They handed power to elites who had been trained to serve colonial interests, not their own populations. They withdrew support almost overnight. The consequences would unfold for decades. Civil wars, coups, famines, ethnic cleansing. Many of Africa's post-colonial tragedies have roots in how rapidly and carelessly the British left. But in 1960, that was the future. In 1960, what mattered was that the British Empire was ending, and everyone knew it. Let's zoom out and look at what actually happened between 1945 and 1965. The numbers are staggering. In 1945, Britain controlled approximately 700 million people across 5 continents. By 1965, that number had dropped to about 5 million, mostly in small islands and territories with no viable path to independence. Here's a partial list of territories that gained independence in those 20 years. India and Pakistan in 1947, Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, in 1948, Burma in 1948, Palestine in 1948 becoming Israel and Jordan, Sudan in 1956, Ghana in 1957, Malaya in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, Sierra Leone in 1961, Tanganyika in 1961, Jamaica and Trinidad in 1962, Uganda in 1962, Kenya in 1963, Malawi and Zambia in 1964, the Gambia in 1965. This isn't decline. This is collapse. And the collapse accelerated as it went. Each successful independence movement inspired others. Each time Britain backed down, it proved that they could be made to leave. The mythology of British power, the idea that resistance was futile, evaporated. Why couldn't Britain hold on? The short answer is, they tried, and it was a disaster. In Kenya, the British response to the Mau Mau uprising included mass detention camps. Recent historical research has revealed the scale of what happened. At least 1.5 million Kenyans were detained. Torture was widespread and systematic. Thousands died. Caroline Elkins, a Harvard historian who documented this period, described it as Britain's gulag. When this history finally emerged decades later, the British government was forced to pay compensation to surviving victims. In 2013, Foreign Secretary William Hague acknowledged that Kenyans had been subject to torture and other forms of ill treatment at the hands of the colonial administration. In Malaya, the British fought a 12-year counterinsurgency campaign against communist guerrillas. They eventually won, but the cost was enormous, and the tactics included forced resettlement of hundreds of thousands of civilians. In Cyprus, British forces faced a Greek Cypriot insurgency demanding union with Greece. The campaign involved detention, harsh interrogation methods, and escalating violence. The pattern was clear. Holding on to colonies by force was possible, but it was expensive, brutal, and ultimately unsustainable. And in the post-1945 world, it was also politically toxic. The United States didn't want European allies fighting colonial wars. The United Nations provided a platform for anti-colonial voices. World opinion had shifted. Britain could be a colonial power, or a respected member of the international community. It could not be both. Subscribe now if you want more content that reveals what mainstream history leaves out. We post every week, and our community is growing fast. So who actually won when the British Empire collapsed? And who lost? The answer is more complicated than you might think. The obvious winners were the colonized peoples who gained independence. Self-determination, after all, is a fundamental human aspiration. Nations that had been ruled by foreign powers for generations finally controlled their own destinies. But independence didn't automatically mean prosperity or freedom. Many former colonies fell into dictatorship, civil war, or economic crisis. The borders Britain drew, often arbitrarily, without regard for ethnic or cultural realities, became sources of conflict that persist to this day. Nigeria's civil war, the partition violence in India and Pakistan, ethnic tensions across Africa. These aren't coincidences. They're legacies. Britain extracted enormous wealth from its colonies over centuries. When they left, they took the wealth but left the problems. They created economies designed to export raw materials to Britain, not to develop local industries. They educated tiny elites while leaving most of the population illiterate. They built railways to move products to ports, not to connect African communities to each other. The economist Utsa Patnaik has estimated that Britain extracted approximately $45 trillion from India alone over 2 centuries, a number that dwarfs all the development investment Britain ever made. So when people ask, wasn't the British Empire good for its colonies, this is the American context that question ignores. But here's another winner you might not expect. The United States. America had opposed European colonialism since its own founding. American leaders saw colonial empires as competitors, not allies. The resources, markets, and strategic positions controlled by European empires were resources, markets, and positions America wanted access to. When the British Empire collapsed, American influence expanded to fill the vacuum. The dollar replaced the pound as the world's reserve currency. American military bases appeared in former British territories. American companies gained access to markets that... But it's also true that decolonization served American interests perfectly. Britain's loss was America's gain. And then there's Britain itself. Was Britain a loser? In the short term, absolutely. The loss of empire was traumatic. It required a fundamental reimagining of British identity. For decades, Britain struggled with what historian Dean Acheson famously described, "Great Britain has lost an empire and has not yet found a role." But in the longer term, Britain became a more normal country. It stopped spending enormous sums maintaining territories that didn't want to be maintained. It focused resources on its own people, the welfare state, the National Health Service, the social safety net. These were built partly because resources were no longer being drained into imperial administration. And without the empire, Britain could no longer pretend to be something it wasn't. It had to find its actual place in the world, which turned out to be as a medium-sized European nation with an outsized cultural influence. Whether that's a loss or just a reality check depends on your perspective. So what's the real lesson of the British Empire's collapse? Here's what most people get wrong. They think empires fall because of external enemies, invasions, conquests, military defeat. But that's not what happened to Britain. Britain won World War II. Britain wasn't invaded. Britain wasn't conquered. Britain's empire collapsed because of internal contradictions, because the whole system was built on a lie, the lie that colonial subjects consented to being ruled, or at least that they couldn't resist. Once that lie was exposed, once Indians and Africans and Malaysians and everyone else made it clear that they did not consent and would fight for their freedom, the empire became unsustainable. Empires require belief. The colonizers must believe they have the right to rule. The colonized must believe, or at least appear to believe, that resistance is futile. When either belief collapses, the empire follows. For Britain, both beliefs collapsed simultaneously. The colonizers, exhausted by war and broke, lost their confidence. The colonized, inspired by wartime rhetoric about freedom and self-determination, found theirs. And when the Americans made clear that they wouldn't support European colonialism, when the Suez Crisis proved that Britain couldn't act without American permission, the game was truly over. Here's what makes this relevant today. Every empire in history has eventually fallen. Every single one. Rome, the Mongols, the Ottomans, the Spanish, the British. Every imperial project that seemed permanent, that seemed destined to last forever, eventually collapsed. The question isn't whether empires fall. The question is how quickly and at what cost. Britain's collapse was remarkably fast, 20 years to dismantle what took centuries to build. And the cost was high, though mostly paid, by the colonized peoples rather than the colonizers. But here's the haunting part. The patterns that led to British collapse are visible in other places too. Overextension, debt, the gap between self-image and reality, the refusal to accept changed circumstances until change is forced upon you. Winston Churchill, speaking after the loss of India, said, "We have thrown away our empire without a single shot being fired." He meant it as criticism, as an indictment of what he saw as weakness and surrender. But maybe throwing away empire wasn't weakness. Maybe it was the first honest thing Britain had done in centuries. The British Empire was built. It was, in many ways, a moral correction, a recognition that some things simply should not exist. What came after wasn't perfect. The post-colonial world has its own problems, its own injustices, its own forms of exploitation. Formal empire was replaced by informal influence, direct control by economic dependency. But something fundamental did change when the British Empire fell. The idea that white Europeans had a right to rule over everyone else, an idea that had shaped world history for 5 centuries, finally, belatedly, began to die. That's the real legacy of those 20 years. Not the specific dates or the individual decisions, but the collapse of an ideology, the end of a certainty. And if you're wondering what comes next, what happens when today's great powers face their own moments of truth, history suggests the answer won't be comfortable for anyone. The empires of the future won't look like the British Empire. They might not even call themselves empires. But the patterns of overreach, self-deception, and inevitable decline, those are eternal. The sun finally set on the British Empire. Eventually, it sets on everything. If this video changed how you think about history, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We cover the stories that textbooks skip and politicians hide. Because understanding the past isn't just academic, it's how you understand the present. And if you want to see how another superpower faced its own moment of collapse, how the Soviet Union went from global power to historical footnote in just 4 years, watch the video appearing on your screen right now. History doesn't repeat, but it definitely rhymes.